Thank you very much, Sarah. Very occasionally in my work as a minister, members of this church have asked me to read a letter. And I mean private letter, personal letters that were sent only to them. And I've always felt a little bit uneasy about that because they weren't my letters. Well, here at MCF, we've been studying a letter, a very ancient letter, that was sent to a bunch of people who lived in a place called Philippi. And Philippi was a major city in what is now the northeast corner of Greece. But here's the thing, this letter now makes up part of the last quarter of the Christian Bible that we know as the New Testament, sacred book that hundreds of millions of people the world over believe to be no less than the Word of God. And we believe that too. It's his love letter to us. But before I read a short extract from this letter, I'd like to show you a video that shows the story and tells the story of a young man who came to believe in this remarkable book, the Bible, as well as in the God who breathed the Bible out. This is Ashley's story.
I'd always been a troublemaker for as long as I can remember. I think by the time I was 13, I was getting into trouble with the police. I was taking drugs, smoking cannabis, I was taking ecstasy, I've been arrested for shoplifting, I've been done for burglary, for arson, criminal damage. There was something about getting into trouble that just really excited me. And the more I tried to sort myself out, the worse that I got. I was selling most drugs in most nightclubs. Those places that I wasn't selling drugs, I made sure I had people selling drugs for me in those places. I got so good at selling drugs, I got so good at doing what I was doing, that I started to get noticed by the people above me. It wasn't long before I started selling drugs for them. Now, we was buying drugs from people like the Albanian Mafia, and we're selling to the likes of Hell's Angels. We was buying 1 or 2 kilos of cocaine a week. And I was looking for fulfillment in drugs, in sex, in power, in my status. The only problem is when you have a status, when you have a reputation, you've got to live up to that. And you've got to do things to make sure that people don't take that from you. The guy that I was selling drugs for, the gang leader, as you might call him, he phoned me up and told me that he'd been attacked by a rival gang. And so he asked me to go to one of the safe houses and to pick up a firearm. I was nervous, very nervous about what was about to happen. But I went to this safe house and I put on a brave front, and I picked up a firearm, and I remember getting into my friend's car that day, leaving the house with the intention to kill. That day, if I'd have bumped into these guys, if we'd have found the people that we was looking for, I'd have pulled the trigger. Thankfully, that day I never had to do what I thought I was going to have to do, and we didn't find anybody. And I think, if I'm honest, at that point, I realized that I needed help. I desperately needed help. Although I knew that I needed help, I couldn't help myself. And so slowly, over time, as I got into more and more trouble, I ended up in prison. And I remember looking out the little window in this prison wagon with my hands cuffed, looking at the guards and the towers, and seeing the gates, and suddenly realizing that, you know what, you're not a gangster, you're an idiot. You've messed up your life, and now you've got to deal with the consequences. You're in prison. A prisoner who'd been transferred with me from one prison to the other came to me and started to talk to me about God. I couldn't understand what I was hearing. I couldn't understand it. Here I was in prison with my life in danger, and this guy wanted to talk to me about God. How could God help me? How could God help me in the situation that I got myself into? It was a couple of days later that I was walking past the chapel sign-up sheet. So when you're in prison, what you do is you sign up your name to chapel, and on a Sunday a guard would come to you and they'd release you from your cell and they'd take you to the chapel. And I signed up my name to go to chapel. For some reason, at that very moment in time, a sense of peace hit me that I'd never experienced anywhere else before. So I remember going back to my cell, and I don't remember exactly what I said, but it was something along the lines of, God, if you're out there, if you are who these people say you are, then help me. Whatever it costs, whatever I have to do, whatever the cost to me may be, I am yours. I give my life to you. Please take my life and do with it whatever you want. The gang that I was involved with were caught in a drugs raid, and they were taken off the streets. The relationships that we're in, they started to break down. all the time, this gave me more and more time to work on my relationship with God. I was no longer a drug addict. There was no drugs rehabilitation. There was no counseling. There was no replacement therapy. It was just the power of God, His word and prayer. What I found when I came to church was something different. The people were different. They seemed to have this sense of joy about them. They were loving and caring, and they just accepted me for who I was. I'm looking forward to the future. I'm not entirely sure where this journey is going to lead me, but I'm looking forward to seeing where it's going. My life has changed massively. All I want to do now is try and help people not to make the same mistakes that I made. I've been back to a prison, and I got to share a message of hope with the people that were in there. I'm working with a local youth group, trying to encourage those kids not to make the same mistakes that I made.
So there's a young man whose whole life was turned around by what he said was the power of God and His word. So I'm going to read a very short section of that letter that I mentioned to these people in Philippi, where Paul says this: I want to know Christ. Yes, to know the power of His resurrection and participation in His sufferings, becoming like Him in His death. And so somehow attaining to the resurrection from the dead. Not that I've already obtained all of this, he says, or have already arrived at my goal, but I press on to take hold of that for which Christ took hold of me. Brothers and sisters, I don't consider myself yet to have taken hold of it, said Paul, but one thing I do, forgetting what is behind and straining towards what is ahead, I press on towards the goal to gain the prize for which God has called me heavenwards in Christ. I couldn't help but notice, actually, that those two characters, Paul, who wrote this letter, and Ashley, the guy in the video, actually had quite a few things in common. Paul had harmed a great number of people because he used to attack Christian churches. He used to round up Christian believers. He used to put them in prison. Ashley had harmed a lot of people through his drug activity, his arson, his burglary. Paul had been responsible, actually, for many an execution of Christian people. And Ashley had been on the verge of taking a life. Thank God he never had to pull that trigger. And yet both these men had an encounter with God that turned their lives around. In fact, Paul's life had been so deeply, so radically changed that he was now ready to die himself for the sake of Jesus Christ. And some years later, we believe that's exactly what happened to him. He suffered a most violent death. Many historians would say he was beheaded in Rome on account of his faith in Jesus. But in the first couple of sentences of our reading, there are three things that I want to draw your attention to very quickly. Three complementary things that can not only make a positive difference to our lives here on this earth, in the here and now, but will also make all the difference in the world as to what happens with us after we die. And the first thing is this: the Christian life is essentially a relationship. Essentially a relationship. I want to know Christ, said Paul. And that word know actually is a Greek word that's very strong, and it means heart knowledge as much as head knowledge. One of my musical heroes is a country singer called Brad Paisley. Chances are not many of you have heard of Brad Paisley, but I love his music, I love his guitar playing. If you were to ask me, do you know Brad Paisley, Chris? I could say truthfully yes, because I know who he is. I've met him, I've spoken with him. But if you were to ask Brad Paisley, hey Brad, do you know Chris Spracklen? I think he'd probably say something like, who the heck is he? He wouldn't have a clue. And that's because I don't really know him. I know of him, I've spoken with him, but I really know him. And that isn't a perfect analogy, but Paul already knew Jesus. Jesus knew Paul. Paul had a relationship with him, but what he was saying is, I want to know him better and better and better. And hopefully, actually, Jack and Haley, as your lives go on, you'll get to know each other better and better and better and fall more and more deeply in love, actually. But that, dear friends, is the dynamic that's at the heart of being a Christian. Christianity is not about rules, it's not about regulations, it's not about rituals, it's not about religion, it's about a relationship with God that's been made possible through Jesus Christ, who is God in flesh. I came to know Jesus when I was a little child. I've been walking with him ever since. That's something like 55 years of getting to know Jesus. And that's happened as his Spirit's lived within me, as I've spoken to him and listened to him through prayer, and as I've sensed his presence with me as I've read the Bible, his word to us. That's a hard thing to explain. A very hard thing to explain. Probably sounds very strange, very kind of weird if you've never experienced that kind of relationship. But those who have and those who are know that it's the most wonderful thing in the world to know Jesus. To know the God who gave us breath is the greatest thing, as well as being the thing that makes the greatest difference to our everyday life. So number one, the Christian life is essentially, first and foremost, a relationship. It's not a set of rules. I want to know Christ. Second thing, the Christian faith is grounded in Jesus' resurrection. I want to know Christ, said Paul, yes, and to know the power of his resurrection. And maybe some of you are thinking, well, how is it possible that third millennium people like us can actually know someone whose life kicked off the first century? How crazy is that? Because if there's one thing, even in our country, that people know today about Jesus is that he lived 2,000 years ago. So how can we possibly enjoy a relationship with him today? To which the answer is this: that Jesus' death, though hugely significant in its own right, was merely temporary. Writing just 20 years after Jesus died, Paul said this: Christ died for our sins, as the Bible said he would. He was buried, but he was also raised from the dead on the third day, just as the scriptures that had been written hundreds of years before said. And says Paul, he was seen by Peter, and then by the other disciples, and after that he was seen by more than 500 people, all at the same time, most of whom are still alive. Paul's writing this within 20 years of Jesus' death. And he said, hey, a lot of these people who saw him alive again after his death, still alive. And try as many people have, no one has been able to disprove that. Nobody. So very clever people have tried and ended up believing it and trusting the risen Jesus. Michael Lee Strobel has written a lot of books, and formerly he was an investigative journalist with the Chicago Tribune. And he said that one time he went to a psychologist friend of his. This was before he became a Christian, was still looking into the Christian faith. And he said he'd been reading the Bible, and he said to this psychologist friend, if 500 people claimed to see Jesus after he died, it must have been an hallucination. And his friend, the psychologist, said hallucinations are individual events. If 500 people had the same hallucination, that's a bigger miracle than the resurrection. Paul met the risen Jesus, turned him around. Millions of people ever since have done the same, including many people in this room. Jesus' resurrection wasn't a reincarnation. It wasn't a resuscitation. It wasn't a hoax. It's not a myth. It happened. And all his initial followers were prepared to die themselves, some of them horrifically, rather than deny that they'd seen Jesus alive from the dead. I wonder, is there anything so important that you'd be prepared to die for it, even if you knew it was a lie? The disciples died because they were preaching the resurrection. Just like Paul's, our faith is grounded in the resurrection of Jesus, which brings me to the last thing I want to say this morning, and it's this: the Christian hope is realized in our own resurrection. Realized in the sense of fulfilled, ultimately actualized, brought to fruition. And so somehow, says Paul, attaining to the resurrection from the dead. Just over a week ago this last Friday, had a phone call from the daughter of one of our elderly members, 93-year-old man, to say that he'd passed away in hospital. His name was Ray. And so a week ago, Friday, we lost one of our members. But I don't mean lost in the deepest sense of lost, because you can't really be lost if people know where you are, and we know where Ray is, because his faith was firmly in the faith and in the one who conquered death, Jesus. And so now we believe Ray is with Jesus, because that was his promise. He said to the thief on the cross next to him, "You'll be with me today in paradise." Just a few days after Ray, my dear mum-in-law passed away. So especially for my wife and her 3 siblings, together with their children, it's a really sad time right now. But there is one wonderful consolation. We know where she's gone. Because Mum's hope was in Jesus' resurrection. And because he rose, and because her life is hidden in his life, she too is going to rise. To live in a place where there'll be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain. I came across another lovely little video this week, which is about a lady who, well, I'll let her tell her own story, but she had a really difficult time having a child. And I find that story very moving, and I pray that you will see in this telling of her story the reality of what faith in Jesus is all about. So we're going to stay just a bit longer, and it's a very short video. Thanks for listening to me. Thanks for being here today on behalf of Hayley and Jack. Thank you so much for coming. I understand you're going to shift across to our other building to have lunch together. That's brilliant. If you've got any questions about anything I've said, don't agree with it, want to have a little tete-a-tete at the door, that's fine. I'll be standing there. I'm not running away. We've also got little leaflets and booklets you're free to take away if you want to know more about Christian faith. Here's this lady's story, and then we're going to sing our final song, I think. Thanks, Sam.
We've been working through the grief of losing our twins. We then went on to, in total, suffer 10 miscarriages. We fell pregnant with our daughter. And when Eden was born, I had to publicly give thanks for this little girl and acknowledge God's part in his hand in it. And we put together a Thanksgiving service. And I started to read my Bible more and more. And after having Eden dedicated, I realised that I needed to be baptised. So since coming to know Jesus, life hasn't been easy. I never expect God to lift me out of my circumstances. Jesus is a rock that I stand on, and sometimes I don't stand, I cling on for dear life, but I've never ever been alone. When I contacted this church, they had no idea of the baggage that I lugged behind me, no idea at all. But what they did do was welcome me with open arms and embrace me. And as I began to unpack all that baggage, I saw the love of Jesus in them, through them. And, you know, when you can look into the face of Jesus and know that you have been made new in him, yeah, that's a feeling like no other. And there is no New Age practice that can offer you freedom and peace or anything like Jesus.